And then went down to the ship, set keel to breakers forth on the godly sea, and we set up mast and sail on that swart ship, bore sheep aboard her, and our bodies also heavy with weeping, and winds from sternward bore us out onward with belly and canvas. Circe's this craft, the trim-coiffed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus with stretched sail we went over sea till day's end. Sun to his slumber, shadows o'er all the ocean. Came we then to the bounds of deepest water, to the Cimmerian lands and peopled cities, covered with close-webbed mist, unpierced ever with glitter of sun rays, nor with stars stretched, nor looking back from heaven. Swartest night stretched over wretched men there. The ocean flowing backward, came we then to the place aforesaid by Circe. Here did they rites, Perimedes and Eurylochus, and drawing sword from my hip, I dug the L-square pitkin, poured we libations unto each the dead, first mead, and then sweet wine, water mixed with white flour. Then prayed I many a prayer to the sickly death's heads, as set in Ithaca, sterile bulls are the best for sacrifice, heaping the pyre with goods, a sheep to Tiresias only, black and a bell sheep. Dark blood flowed in the fosse, souls out of Erebus, cadaverous dead, of brides, of youths, and of the old who had borne much. Souls stained with recent tears, girls tender, men many mauled with bronze lance heads, battle spoil bearing yet dreary arms. These many crowded about me, with shouting pallor upon me, cried to my men for more beasts, slaughtered the herds, sheep slain of bronze, poured ointment, cried to the gods, to Pluto the strong, and praised Proserpine. Unsheathed the narrow sword, I sat to keep off the impetuous, impotent dead, till I should hear Tiresias. But first Elpenor came, our friend Elpenor, unburied, cast on the wide earth, limbs that we left in the house of Circe, unwept, unwrapped in sepulchre, since toils urged other. Pitiful spirit. And I cried in hurried speech, Elpenor, how art thou come to this dark coast? Camest thou afoot outstripping seamen? And he in heavy speech, ill fate and abundant wine. I slept in Circe's ingle. Going down the long ladder unguarded, I fell against the buttress, shattered the nape nerve, the soul sought Avernus. But thou, O king, I bid remember me, unwept, unburied, heap up mine arms by tomb, by seaboard, and inscribed, a man of no fortune, and with a name to come, and set my oar up that I swung mid-fellows. And Anticlea came, whom I beat off, and then Tiresias, Theban, holding his golden wand, knew me and spoke first. A second time? Why, man of ill star, facing the sunless dead in this joyless region? Stand from the fosse, leave me my bloody befer, for soothsay. And I stepped back, and he, strong with the blood, said then, Odysseus, shalt return through spiteful Neptune over dark seas, lose all companions. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, welcome, friends, to the 60th episode of Crime and Punishment, a legal podcast, absolutely not political. It is the official podcast of the Invictus Law Firm, PA, a criminal defense law firm in Orlando, Florida. A rather long introduction to today's program, but a necessary one, especially since we are talking about criminal defense. This is a criminal defense law firm, and we are talking about the trial of Ezra Pound, which you may have noticed in the social media advertisements, was a treason trial. He spent 13 years in prison and insane asylums for it being alleged that he was a fascist propagandist. We're going to read from The Trial of Ezra Pound, which is the book on this, because it's written by Julian Cornell, who was Ezra Pound's lawyer in this affair. Couldn't get a more authoritative text. I have no idea how I found this or how many years I've had it, but what a fascinating case. Brian says, good afternoon from the west. Good afternoon from the east. Good buddy. Symphony says, sure was a lucky coincidence the Pound went insane while under the care of the army prison system. Elsewise, the public might have been forced to question Allied propaganda at his trial. Yeah, and a lot of strange things about the trial of Ezra Pound. I guess most people don't know, you might if you're in this audience, most people don't know that after World War II, the Allies prosecuted everybody they could get their hands on. One other scholar that we have read on this program at great length is Carl Schmitt. He narrowly escaped the prosecutions, but Ezra Pound did not. Ezra Pound, like I said, spent 13 years in prison for this. In fact, the book I was reading from, The Cantos, which is like 6 inches thick, a lot of that was written in the prison camps. That's exactly what they were, prison camps. So let's read the introduction to this book. I think the lawyer for Ezra Pound can do a better job than me of explaining the case. After having been confined by the United States government for 13 years on charges of treason, Ezra Pound was released from St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington in April 1958. His indictment was dismissed, and he was allowed to return to Italy. The story of his trial, confinement, and eventual release is told here, including all the relevant documentary material from my files and public records. I was Pound's lawyer. This is an unusual story. Ezra Pound was imprisoned for 13 years because of an alleged crime which was never proved. He was imprisoned despite the fact that he is one of the great literary figures of our time, perhaps in part because of that fact. A many-sided man, Pound did not confine himself to poetry. He indulged also in political and economic theories, which he expounded over the Rome radio during World War II. Some of his broadcasts were highly critical, even contemptuous, of the policies of the United States and its allies. The indictment charged that Pound, an American citizen, in making these broadcasts, committed treason by giving aid and comfort to the enemy. This Pound has always vigorously denied. The treason, he said, was in the White House, not in Rapallo. However that may be, one fact clearly emerges. When he arrived in Washington jail, Pound was an old man, tired and sick, unable to understand his predicament sufficiently well to defend himself. For this reason, he was adjudged unfit to be tried and was eventually released. People will soon forget, if they have not already forgotten, the war-born passions which brought Ezra Pound to the courtroom, but they will forever remember his verse and will want to know why and how he came to be imprisoned for his utterances. Hence, this book. You might wonder, why is this important? He was released in 1958. So this was, how many years is that? 60, 80 years ago? He was released 60, I don't know. This is why I went to law school, so I don't have to do math. It's a long time ago, before any of us were even born. So why does it matter? And why do not just one episode, but multiple episodes on the trial of Ezra Pound? Because he was clearly not a guy on the front lines. He never, to my knowledge, had any intention of taking up arms against United States soldiers in Italy. Would it have mattered if he was in Italy, or if he was in Germany, or if he was in America, or if he was in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union, you might recall, was our ally during World War II. If Ezra Pound had been in the Soviet Union, an allied state, during World War II, making radio broadcasts that were not just critical, but contemptuous of the United States government and United States foreign policy, would have been charged with treason. If he was in the United States and it was wartime and he was making these radio broadcasts, would he have been charged with treason for giving aid and comfort to the enemy? See a lot of cases where groups like Patriot Front or just plain individuals are posting flyers or, God forbid, stickers. How do you get those off? Onto, electric transformers and posting bulletins and, taping things to walls. I mean, just horrific vandalism. Not seen since the Christian riots in ancient Rome. And they're being jammed up for hate crimes charges, for incitement of the neighborhood, for attacking immigrants. It's insane. But it's not like we haven't seen the U.S. government do something like this before. In fact, as Antifa will be fast to point out to you, the United States government is Antifa. And as we see a disturbing trend on Twitter lately, members and former members of the military are really fast to point out that they're all Antifa now. Always were, by the way. In fact, Antifa won 2 world wars, all by their lonesomes. God bless them. How? I don't know. Because fascism didn't exist until after the First World War. But God bless them. They won 2 world wars. The military has always been Antifa. They've always been blue-haired Marxists. Nothing new. To be persecuted for political speech. Nothing new to be accused of treason because you dare to criticize the United States government. It doesn't matter how famous you are. It doesn't matter that you're a poet. You're all on the chopping block. So that's why it's important to understand the historical context of what is going on today, to understand that you've never been safe. It doesn't matter if it's post 9/11 or post Cold War or post World War II or post World War I or post Spanish American War. This is the reality of power. There's a book called Unintended Consequences that I'm absolutely not endorsing because it's horrible. But it's got a lot of history in it. The novelist, the guy that wrote the book, can you call that a novel? I mean, it's a massive tome. It's like 1,000 pages. He goes into a lot of historical episodes. And one of them is the bonus army. So a lot of these veterans came back from the First World War. And they were promised this bonus, that bonus. They all came back, like in so many wars, and were completely homeless. No benefits. Their bonuses were denied. So they made this massive army to go camp in Washington, D.C., camp outside the White House, and say, hey, you promised us X, Y, and Z. We went and fought. We won our bonus. And the White House got real tired of that real fast, sent in a few generals, and burned down this tent camp and killed American veterans in Washington, D.C. This whole episode, it does not exist. Memory hold is the term we use now. That was after World War I. That was before, this whole Hitler craze started. This is back in the quote-unquote golden days, when America was America. They sent MacArthur himself. MacArthur, of course, later became General MacArthur, who was the presidential hopeful, the guy that invaded Japan and fought the Pacific War, wanted to invade Japan with his full force, unprecedented military campaign, and then, too bad, Truman dropped the bomb. But that MacArthur, American hero MacArthur, had no compunction about going to fight veterans in D.C., burn down their tents, and kill them on sight, should they resist. That's the reality of America. That's the reality of power in this country. So, you can feel nostalgic about when you were in elementary school saying the Pledge of Allegiance with your hand over your heart and then singing, and I'm proud to be an American. But this is how it's always been. They were just more effective at this free speech, land of the free, home of the brave propaganda before recent memory. So that's why it's important. One of many reasons it's important. Let's continue with the book. Chapter 1. The broadcasts. As the war in Europe was drawing to a close, I sat in a listening booth in the office of the British Information Service in New York City, listening to recordings of several Pound's broadcasts as monitored in London. At the opening of each broadcast, an announcer made the following statement. The Italian radio, acting in accordance with the fascist policy of intellectual freedom and free expression of opinion by those who are qualified to hold it, following the tradition of Italian hospitality, has offered Dr. Ezra Pound the use of the microphone twice a week. It is understood that he will not be asked to say anything whatsoever that goes against his conscience or anything incompatible with his duties as a citizen of the United States of America. What? On fascist radio? How could they say such a thing? Intellectual freedom? The fascist policy of intellectual freedom and free expression of opinion? What kind of twilight zone are we living in here? He's not being forced to say anything that would go against his duties as a citizen of the USA. Not forced to say anything by these evil fascists that would go against his own conscience. Unthinkable. This must be more propaganda, of course. Then I, that is Julian Cornell, the lawyer for Ezra Pound, heard the voice of Ezra Pound, speaking in the folksy drawl of a plainsman from the western United States. This was not Pound's usual manner of speech, but was affected by him for the purpose of the broadcasts. With his keen ear for language, Pound was a wonderful mimic, able to imitate to perfection the sort of speech which he probably assumed would appeal to the average listener. The broadcasts did not sound treasonable to me. The crime of treason is defined in the Constitution as the levying of war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. There was no criticism of the Allied war effort in the broadcasts. Nothing was said to discourage or disturb American soldiers or their families. Pound's main concern was with usury and other economic sins, which he conceived were being committed by an international conspiracy of Jewish bankers who were the powers behind the throne in England and had succeeded in duping the government of the United States. Now, is that treason or what? You can't say that. I don't care if you're in the Soviet Union or the US or Italy. I don't care if it's wartime. I don't care if it's PBS or YouTube. My God, Dr. Pound, you can't say that. The broadcasts were, in essence, lectures in history and political and economic theory, highly critical of the course of American government, beginning with Alexander Hamilton, who Pound believed started the country down the road to financial ruin. The American people were told that they did not understand what was going on in Europe, and if they did, the war would not have been necessary. It was Pound himself who had insisted that the Italian radio authorities begin the broadcasts with the statement quoted above, explaining that everything which he was saying was said of his own free will. There is no doubt that his speeches were his own. No Italian propagandist would have been capable of writing them. I never knew of anyone who heard these broadcasts over the radio, although they were received and monitored in the United States. As a radio figure, Pound did not command the interest of Lord Ha-Ha, Axis Sally, or Tokyo Rose. He was not an entertainer, and apparently did not care whether anyone listened to him or not. You want to read The Little Prince, buddy? All right. Come on in and sit down here. We'll read The Little Prince after Daddy's done, all right? That's Odysseus, here at the office with Father. His name comes from the Cantos. So does Cesare's middle name. That's a story for another time. He was not an entertainer and apparently did not care whether anyone listened to him or not. It seems most unlikely that those who did hear him could have lost any affection for the United States or its war effort. It is also unlikely that any jury would reach the conclusion that the broadcasts gave aid and comfort to the enemy, or that Pound was doing anything but exercising the good old American prerogative of criticizing his government, including even President Roosevelt. The criticism was scurrilous and vituperative. It reminded me of the way Wall Street bankers and lawyers used to talk about that scallywag in the White House during the early days of the New Deal. There was a rumor that the Italian radio officials eventually cut him off the air because they were afraid that he was giving information to the Allies in some sort of code. Of course, this was not true, but Pound's strange mixture of historical and economic ideas did have a cryptic sound to it. The indictment specifically mentions certain of the broadcasts, presumably because witnesses were available to prove that Pound made them. The government's lawyers refused to show me these broadcasts, although they planned to use them at Pound's trial. What? The federal government had evidence that they planned to present at trial to accuse someone of the highest crime in the country, and they won't let the defense lawyer see the broadcasts, won't let him review the evidence. So when you hear about what we talk about on this program a lot, what's in the news? Things like the federal government's hiding information. The federal government is lying in search affidavits, and as soon as it's issued, they've retracted all of that. Redacted, all of that information. That's nothing new. This whole trial by ambush thing, it doesn't exist anymore in states like Florida, thank God, which is why I'll probably never move out of this state again. But in the federal government, that's the way it goes. They don't have to give you anything. National security. The government's lawyers refused to show me these broadcasts, although they had planned to use them at Pound's trial. Ironically, my only information about the broadcasts came not from our own government, but from the British Information Service, which had kindly made available to me the recordings which they had on file. Years later, after Pound's case was closed, the transcripts of his broadcast made by the United States government became accessible at the National Archives. I obtained a complete set, but found them dreary reading. 2 complete broadcasts are printed in an appendix to this book. Should we read the broadcasts? Maybe we should do like a separate episode just on the broadcasts, and yet another one on the transcript of the trial, which is also at the end of the book. So there's a brief concerning bail. We're going to read about that. Hopefully we'll get to that today. Not the brief itself, but the issue of his bail and his transfer to the asylum to be evaluated. Text of the indictment is Appendix 2. Here we go. Text of the broadcasts. April 23rd, 1942 and May 15th, 1943. Europe calling. Ezra Pound speaking. We'll get to that some other time. That's Chapter 1, about the broadcasts. Chapter 2, Counsel for Defense. How do you find a lawyer crazy enough to defend someone like Ezra Pound? Someone accused of treason. Someone accused of something way worse than treason. Of sympathizing with fascists. How do you find a lawyer crazy enough to take a case like that? Well, lucky for us, that's exactly what Chapter 2 is about. Counsel for the Defense. My friend James Laughlin asked me in September 1945 if I would be willing to undertake the defense of Ezra Pound. Laughlin was Pound's publisher. He explained to me that Pound had made broadcasts over the Rome radio for which he had been indicted on charges of treason and would soon be brought to the United States for trial. I readily agreed to look into the case, as I had always enjoyed fighting for an underdog. Much of my time in those days was spent defending the civil liberties of persons who had become entangled with the law in one way or another, such as aliens, ministers, and conscientious objectors who were having difficulties with the Selective Service law. I told Laughlin that I was interested in taking Pound's case, but would need to see him and learn more about their circumstances. Laughlin then wrote to Arthur V. Moore of Shakespeare and Parkin, recommending that I be retained as counsel for the defense. Shakespeare and Parkman were solicitors for Mrs. Pound, whose maiden name was Shakespeare. Solicitors, they're in London. They call them that over there, solicitors and barristers. Letter from Arthur V. Moore to James Laughlin, London, 9th October, 1945. Dear Mr. Laughlin, just kidding, we're not going to read that in an English accent. Thank you for your letter of 30th September and for your very kind assistance in suggesting Mr. Julian Cornell as counsel for defense of our friend. I am, however, rather troubled with the thought that whatever his friends may think or wish to do for him, he will much prefer to conduct his defense in his own manner, and by such means as may seem expedient to him. In other words, Dr. Pound is a very difficult client. I have, however, written to him urging him to give my firm instructions to obtain the best possible counsel, and I have advised him not to attempt to address the court in his own defense, but to allow a lawyer experienced in court procedure to represent his interests, which is something you often have to tell clients, but especially when they happen to be geniuses. You have no idea how difficult it is to get your genius clients to not talk on their own behalf. That is a fight in and of itself. I have not received any reply to my letter, and like yourself, I have no way of knowing whether it will be delivered to him. I have today, however, heard from Italy that correspondence with our friend is now officially permitted, and the address you should use is as follows. And then they give the address at the army base in the Mediterranean theater. Yes, Odysseus. Yes, you can have a snack as soon as I'm done, which will be 28 minutes, okay? Another difficulty with which I am confronted is the matter of finance. Dorothy, in one of her letters to me, states she is prepared to spend her last penny in the defense of her husband, but all her investments and funds in this country are in the hands of the official custodian of enemy property, to whom I applied for release of funds to enable me to remit money to Dorothy for her immediate needs. I was informed by this official that release could be obtained provided I obtained confirmation from American sources in Italy that Dorothy claimed protection as an American citizen, and that there was no charge of any description filed against her personally. I asked Dorothy to obtain this, and she informs me that the American consul at Genoa has informed her status as an American citizen has lapsed, and she has not renewed her passport since 1941. How about that? You live in Italy long enough, 4 years by my count. You have your property seized by the custodian of enemy property in a country that's not even the one your husband's being charged in, and you can't get that money back because your citizenship has lapsed. Nothing at all dirty about any of that. I have written to the American Embassy in London for confirmation of this ruling and expect it has been referred to Washington, D.C. for confirmation. I wonder whether Mr. McLeish could find out anything about it. Such a deprivation of citizenship would leave Dorothy a stateless person, for she lost her British nationality on her marriage in 1914, and the officials in this country will now have no interest in her welfare until peace is officially made with Italy, when her funds will be then released. So Dorothy was British, married Pound in 1914. When she did that, she lost her British nationality, became an American. However, because of this thing going on against her husband, America says, nope, your citizenship here has lapsed. You haven't had a passport in 4 years. We don't recognize you. So now she has no country at all. As we pointed out in myriad cases on this program, that's just federal government policy 101. That's Odysseus. That's law enforcement 101. That's prosecution 101. You can't get the guy. You can't hurt him. Go after his family. Go after his wife. Seen it 100 times before. 1,000. This is just one of those instances. You don't want to plead guilty to treason. You don't want to be hanged. You don't want to give us, the easy win. How about this? Your wife is no longer a citizen in this country. We've seized all her property as enemy property. How would you like to plead now, Dr. Pound? I am only therefore in a position to say that any fees which Mr. Cornell may charge could only be paid by Dorothy as and when her money is available, for she has ample to meet the costs, but if it will help matters, I should be prepared to undertake that any cost would eventually be met, and if required, I would make a personal remittance on account for this purpose. Very big of him. In other words, he's going to vouch for this lady, and he's going to make sure that the American lawyer's costs are paid. That's near unheard of. Everything you have told me concerning Mr. Cornell is very interesting, and I am in full agreement that his services should be retained. But as I have explained, I am not yet in a position to give him definite instructions until I hear from our friend that he is in agreement. So, this is the background as to what's going on here. And then it has a few more letters about this back and forth here. Free speech, propaganda, letter from Ezra Pound. Here we go. So, a few days after this letter, Laughlin showed me, that is the lawyer, buy you a coffee. What is this? Are you trying to get me banned from YouTube? Hiya, I hoped I could super chat you here. Do you have a button I can tip you on? I'm in the UK and I have can I have a look-see around for some other way to buy you a coffee? No one ever offers me money. I am very suspicious right now. But no, we do not have a super chat here. This is not a moneyed program, if you couldn't tell. You could shop at our virus style. Give us some of that delicious t-shirt money. But I didn't post the link today, because we're just not a moneyed program. So, a few days after this letter, Laughlin showed the lawyer a letter which Pound had recently written to Shakespeare and Parkin. Shakespeare, his wife? Although Pound had been held in confinement all summer at the military disciplinary center of the United States Army near Pisa, Italy, which is why they call it the Paisan Cantos, the cantos in this massive tome that he wrote in the prison camps. Those are the Paisan Cantos because he wrote them at the military prison camp in Pisa, Italy. He says in this letter that his wife had not been permitted to visit him until 2 days previously. This is a letter from Ezra Pound. Gentlemen, I am very glad to get your letter of the 7th, ulto, resent on the 24th, which is the first that has reached me from the outer world, though Dorothy was permitted to visit me 2 days ago and brought the good news of Omar. I am very much pleased with his independence and initiative in all ways. So he's been in this prison camp for months, not allowed to see his wife, not allowed to... In fact, we're going to skip ahead to where the lawyer lays out the facts to the judge, because this really tells the story. Affidavit of Julian Cornell. But what I'm getting at here, not only was he not allowed to see his wife in all this time, he's not allowed to receive outside mail. He has no idea if anyone even knows he's alive, right? No idea what his wife and daughter think has happened to him. And the lawyer's about to spell that out. But this is just how it goes, you know? And it's amazing that, oh, wait a minute, now he has lawyers? He has lawyers in the United Kingdom, he has lawyers in the United States. Well, now we have to let him see his wife. We have to let him receive mail. We have to stop throwing his mail in the trash. Once you have lawyers, the whole situation changes. It's like magic. So let's read this. Because they're going to try to get him out on bond, right? Try to get him evaluated by a doctor. Try to get him sent to a hospital. Because these conditions are just inappropriate for someone like Pound, who's not some guerrilla fighter. He's a poet, for God's sake. Affidavit of Julian Cornell, filed in United States District Court for the District of Columbia, November 27th, 1945, in support of application for bail. Julian Cornell, being duly sworn, deposes and says, I am an attorney at law of New York, and have appeared herein for the defendant, Ezra Pound, at the request of his London solicitors, that is, of course, his lawyers, and with the permission of the court for the sole purpose of his arraignment. Arraignment's where you go in and you say guilty or not guilty. Basically, they read the charges against you, you tell them guilty or not guilty. So he's saying he's only showing up for Dr. Pound in this particular instance for the arraignment. That's it. Odysseus, please stop touching that printer. Thank you. I must report that the defendant, Ezra Pound, after his arrest on a charge of treason last May, has been continuously held incommunicado in solitary confinement under such extreme conditions that he suffered a complete mental collapse and loss of memory. Although he has partially recovered his health, I believe that he is still insane, and that if he remains in prison, he may never recover, and not only will he be unable to stand trial on this indictment, but one of the greatest literary geniuses of these times will be permanently eclipsed. I urge this court to order his removal at once from the District of Columbia Jail, where he is now confined, to a civilian mental hospital or sanatorium under bail, or that, if bail is not permitted, he be removed to a civilian mental hospital or sanatorium operated by the United States and placed in custody of a civilian physician. I believe that such action is imperative, and that if it is not taken immediately, he will never recover his senses sufficiently to defend himself against the indictment, which has been handed up to the court. So, he's taken to D.C., placed in solitary confinement, held there for months. He's going insane, literally. And 60 years later, we're going to pretend that it's new. It's some new crime by this new administration, this new federal government, when they put Proud Boys in a detention camp in Washington, D.C., exactly where they held Ezra Pound. Yes, Odysseus.
Paper.
Okay, we will get you paper. They pretend that it's news that this happens to the Proud Boys and to right-wingers and to all these people participating in this insurrection. News like this never happened in the Bonus Army riot where MacArthur and other generals went and burned this camp down of the veterans. The same District of Columbia where they did this to Ezra Pound, a poet that they accused of giving aid and comfort to the enemy in a treasonous act. This affidavit is accompanied by a memorandum of law relating to the crime charged, showing that the statutes permit the admission of the defendant to bail, although treason is a capital offense. This affidavit will be confined to the facts in the case, which are stated to the best of my information and belief, to the extent necessary for the purposes of the relief now prayed for. In order to furnish the court with further information about the defendant, if desired, I have appended as Exhibit A copy of the only material concerning him, which has been published currently, namely an article which appeared in the newspaper PM, New York, for November 25th, 1945. Since the release of the defendant from prison depends upon the likelihood that he will not attempt to leave the jurisdiction of the court while the trial is pending, I shall acquaint the court briefly with his history before proceeding to the particulars bearing directly upon the present application. So, there are two things that you've got to prove when you're asking a court for bail. One, my client is not a risk to the community. My client's not violent. My client's not, some psychopath that's going to go hunt down, usually in a violent case, the victim that they've already beat up, right? Allegedly. The other thing is, they can't be a flight risk. Well, Ezra Pound's an international man of mystery. He lived in Italy. He's an expat. He's also not from D.C. To my knowledge, had no family in D.C. Born in Idaho, Haley, Idaho. So he's, by all technical standards, he's a flight risk, right? But this guy's arguing why he's not a flight risk. That's what this whole thing is about. And so he's going to, because nobody's even contending, nobody's pretending that he's a violent threat to the community, right? So really what this motion for bail comes down to is he's not a flight risk. And let me tell you why, says the lawyer. Ezra Pound is now 60 years of age. He was born at Haley, Idaho on October 30th, 1885, of Quaker and New England stock. his forebears, which include members of the Loomis, Wadsworth, and Weston families, having emigrated to this country from England with the early colonists. His grandfather, Thaddeus C. Pound, was a member of Congress from Wisconsin in 1878 and also was acting governor of that state. His father, during most of his life, served the United States Treasury in a technical capacity at the Philadelphia Mint. Pound was educated at Hamilton College, Clinton, New York, from which he graduated in 1905 with the degree of Ph.B., and the University of Pennsylvania, where he received an M.A. degree. He was also awarded the honorary degree of D.Lit by Hamilton College in 1939, and cited by the college in these terms, which gives some indication of his tremendous stature in the field of letters. This is, when he got his honorary doctorate, this is what they said about him, right? Ezra Pound, native of Idaho, graduate of Hamilton College in the class of 1905, poet, critic, and prose writer of great distinction. Since completing your college career, you have had a life full of significance in the arts. You have found that you could work more happily in Europe than in America, and so have lived most of the past 30 years an expatriate, making your home in England, France, and Italy, but your writings are known wherever English is read. Your feet have trodden paths, however, where the great reading public could give you few followers, into Provençal and Italian poetry, and into Anglo-Saxon and Chinese. From all of these excursions, you have brought back treasure. Your translations from the Chinese have, for example, led one of the most gifted of contemporary poets to call you the inventor of Chinese poetry of our time. Your alma mater, however, is an old lady who has not always understood where you were going, but she has watched you with great interest and pride, if not always with understanding. The larger public has also been at times amazed at your political and economic as well as your artistic credo, and you have retaliated by making yourself, not unintentionally perhaps, their gadfly. Your range of interests is immense, and whether or not your theories of society survive, your name is permanently linked with the development of English poetry in the 20th century. Your reputation is international. You have guided many poets into new paths. You have pointed new directions, and the historian of the future is tracing the development of your growing mind will inevitably, we are happy to think, be led to Hamilton and to the influence of your college teachers. You have ever been a generous champion of younger writers as well as artists in other fields, and for this fine and rare human quality, and for your own achievements in poetry and prose, we honor you. That was the quotation. Now we are back to Cornell's writing, The Judge. The trail which brought... He's copying me. The trail which brought Pound into such distinction at the hands of his countrymen led entirely along foreign paths, beginning soon after he left college when he made his abode in Venice. And then it's just going to go into James Joyce and all these people, his influence on the Imagists, his influence on Japanese and Chinese poetry, so on and so forth. It just goes on and on and on and on. His career into the Second World War. In 1939, when it appeared that war was approaching and that the United States might be involved, Pound journeyed back to his native land, where he saw such statement as a list of names you will not recognize, neither do I, to be quite honest, all in a vain effort to move the nation's policy towards paths which he thought were the paths to peace. Failing at this task, he returned to Rapallo, where he lived with his family until the Germans drove them back into the hills. No, don't touch that. Early in May of this year, Pound accosted the first American he saw, a Negro soldier advancing with the native partigiani, by whom he was taken at his own request to an American at Genoa. Pound was under house arrest during this time, being treated as a political prisoner. This is how he got jammed up. You remember that?
Fun.
Thank you, Odysseus. You remember that movie SWAT with Colin Farrell?
Yes.
And thank you. And the bad guy was pulled over because of a tail light, and turns out he's like this just massive criminal, part of this international crime syndicate, pulled over because of a broken tail light. He's like, whatever. So, same with Pound here. Oh, we've caught us a big fish now. Look at this international guy, right? This super famous literary figure who dared to criticize United States government policy during a time of war after he dared to counsel U.S. representatives and statesmen against war to begin with. Said, no, we should seek paths to peace. How dare he? That would be like, could you imagine in our modern times a political candidate or a literary figure saying to other statesmen, no, we shouldn't go to war with Russia. What are you people doing? We shouldn't start a war like that. What in God's name are you thinking? What would happen to a person like that? So, he did all that, and then he hit a Negro soldier. So, he's of course treated as a terrorist. He is treated as a political prisoner, as his lawyer calls it. I guess it wasn't in vogue to call people terrorists back then. But he's treated as a political prisoner. He's held at the Counter Information Center at Genoa by the military. After several weeks at Genoa, Pound was handcuffed and taken away by military police in a jeep, naively believing that he was bound for an airport and a plane to the United States. So he assumes, oh, well, all this trouble over me hitting this guy is over. I guess I'm going home now. Thank goodness. He's being transported in a jeep. Where else would he be going but home, right? But his actual destination was an American military prison at Pisa. He was at once beset with fears that he would be thrown with murderers and felons who would kill him, that nobody knew where he was, and nobody would ever know what happened to him. Pound was placed in solitary confinement in a steel cage specially built for him in the prison yard. He knew not whether he would rot away in this cage or be taken out and hanged as a traitor. But far worse than these was the thought that his wife and daughter would never know his fate, and would dream until they reached their own graves of the agony interred in his. Not far away were the pens in which long-term offenders were confined, but all other prisoners were forbidden to speak to Pound, and could not come near him. Not only was the prisoner deprived of all human companionship, but he was given no reading matter to relax his fevered brain. He had nothing to employ his time but a Chinese text of Confucius, which he had been translating, nothing to distract his mind from worry and fear. How do you even begin to comment on that? Were they afraid that he was going to brainwash all these people? That he was going to preach to them till they hated their captors like they didn't already hate everybody there? Were they afraid that he was going to give them real reasons to hate the jailers? Were they afraid that he was going to turn them all fascist if they allowed the prisoners to speak with him? They put this guy in maximum security isolation. For what reason? Yes, Odysseus. Okay, we will look in there in 7 minutes, okay? As someone who has also been in maximum security isolation for absolutely no reason, I can confirm all that they're saying about his state of mind at the time, and I can confirm how horrible it is to think that he's in here with nothing. He can't even write, can't even read, can't speak to anybody. He's just left in there with his mind. A mind like that, that's actual torture. Oh, and actually that's the next sentence. And such mental torture was not all he suffered. It was now full summer, and the Italian sun beat down on the prison yard with unbearable intensity. A military highway ran by, and having no shelter, he could not escape the ceaseless noise and dust. Although all the other prisoners were supplied with tents to keep out the heat and glare of the sun, Pound was given no such protection, probably so that guards could watch him at all times. Whereas other prisoners were let out of the cages for meals and exercise, Pound was always confined. While others were pinned up in groups, he was alone in his cage. After enduring the tropical sun all day, neither sleep nor rest came with the night. Electric lights glared into the poet's cage and burned into his bloodshot eyes. The cage was devoid of all furniture. Pound lay upon the cement floor in his blankets, broiled by the sun and wet by the rain. After about 3 weeks of struggle to maintain his sanity, the wretched man fell ill. The heat and the glare added to the hopelessness of being held incommunicado, and the torture of solitary confinement were more than his aging mind could bear. Pound was stricken with violent and hysterical terror. He lost his memory. He became desperately thin and weak until finally the prison doctor feared for him. Pound was then taken out of his unhappy cage and placed in a tent. He was given a cot to lie upon and medical treatment. The doctor even prescribed a walk each day, but most often the guards neglected to take him out for exercise. While the doctors took measures to keep Pound's body alive, his mind was not rescued. He was still kept in solitary confinement, still held incommunicado, still deprived of all reading matter but religious tracts. Sounds like a jail in South Carolina or something. Maybe his jailers at this American army camp were South Carolinians. As physical strength gradually flowed back into his body, the terror and hysteria subsided somewhat, memory returned, but the great mind remained impaired, and fits of shuddering terror balked his struggle to regain his senses. Not until October 3rd could the prisoner communicate with the outside world. On that day, his wife was allowed to see him for half an hour. 2 weeks later, he saw his daughter for a like period, and on November 3rd, that is a month later, his wife was again permitted to visit him. These visits helped to restore him to some outward semblance of his former self. A week or so ago, that is before writing this affidavit for the judge, Pound being strong enough to travel, he was taken by jeep to Rome and thence by plane to Washington, where he arrived on November 18th and has since remained in the District of Columbia jail. I respectfully pray that the defendant be admitted to bail on the ground that he may be safely released without fear that he would attempt to flee the jurisdiction, and on the further ground that his release under bail is necessary in order that he may secure proper medical treatment. Spoiler alert, the judge denied the request for bail. We are over time. Let's revisit this next week, shall we?
Yes.
Odysseus approves. Well, friends, if you have any suggestions for how to, or if you have any questions about Ezra Pound, there's ways to get to me. Just ask, and we'll talk about Ezra Pound some more next week. Till then, everyone.